So how many of you have watched this TV show American Greed and seen all these horror stories about people who some of them lost their entire life savings, even pulled equity out of their homes to invest even more into these fraud schemes where one guy is basically stealing all their money? And how do you avoid this from happening to you? Now, first of all, I've read all kinds of advice on how to detect and avoid Ponzi schemes, but they're all subjective and they lack certainty. For example, they say, if it sounds too good to be true, avoid it. Or they'll say, avoid anything where they create a false sense of urgency. Act now, this is a limited time offer. Or they'll say, beware of people who have to flaunt their credentials, they'll say, oh, I've donated to this and to that charity. I'm a member of your church. I'm a member of your country club. And they'll say, don't drop your guard just because your neighbors and your family have already invested in this investment. But, this is all subjective stuff and people still get tricked. But there's a much simpler and definitive way to avoid Ponzi schemes. There's actually 2 steps. Number 1, when selecting a financial services company to be the custodian of your money, to entrust your money with, before you invest, only work with a bellwether established company such as E-Trade, Ameritrade, Scottrade, Vanguard, or Charles Schwab. And I mean big companies. One episode of American Greed featured this company called Stanford Financial Group that had 50 offices in several cities, even had its own bank managing $8.5 million for more than 30,000 clients in 136 countries. But it was a privately held company run by one guy. And as it turns out, the CDs, certificates of deposit that clients were putting their money into, was all a Ponzi scheme. But you can see that had these people simply gone to a big, deep discount brokerage company like E-Trade, Ameritrade, or Scottrade, this never would have happened. But so that's your first line of defense and probably the only line of defense you would ever need. But the second line of defense, don't invest in private equity or privately held anything. What is private equity and how do you identify it? Well, it's simple. Don't invest in anything that isn't traded on the stock market. And how do you know if it's indeed traded on the stock market? Well, number 1, you should be able to log on to Yahoo Finance, type in the ticker symbol of that investment and see it and read about it. And number 2, your big bellwether deep discount brokerage will be able to process a trade for that security. Again, this is how the simple line of defense of working with a big bellwether company protects you. They don't broker these fishy private equity investments, and for good reason. So if they can't, then something fishy is going on, and by default, don't touch it. By the way, one thing that you want to look out for is don't invest in these tiny micro-cap companies. The stock prices of these companies can be fraudulently manipulated by bad people. You want to invest in big bellwether companies, and the best way to do that is through index funds. There is nothing wrong with owning one single index fund to represent your entire stock asset class. And of course, unless you're a super aggressive investor with a big appetite for risk, then you're also going to want to invest in bonds. And the best way to do that is to invest in bond index funds. And again, there's nothing wrong with owning one single total bond market index fund to represent your entire bond asset class. Now, I've never heard of an index fund being a fraud scheme. Index funds are highly regulated by the SEC, and they're run by bellwether companies like Vanguard, iShares, SPDR, and Schwab. But if you're super paranoid and you think there might be some sort of MF Global type meltdown and it makes you feel better, just diversify amongst index fund companies. For example, for the stock portion of your investments, you could own SPY and VOO. That way you're diversified between SPDR and Vanguard. But I mean, really, the day that a company like Vanguard turns out to be some sort of fraud scheme is the day that aliens land on Earth and take over the world. It ain't gonna happen.